How many of you have seen the movie The Martian? Anybody seen the movie The Martian with Matt Damon? Y'all have never seen The Martian? It's incredible. Have you ever seen The Martian? Have you ever seen The Martian? Well, let me tell you the gist of The Martian. Okay, it was a book originally by Andy Weir, but Andy Weir's the same guy that wrote Project Hail Mary. Anybody see Project Hail Mary? Yes. Thank you. Matt's seen them all. Let me tell you about The Martian, okay? So the gist of The Martian is that we have figured out a way to go to Mars. And we go to Mars, and we're able to set up habitats and live there for a period of time, and then we're collecting all these samples and all this stuff, and then we're coming back. Well, on the walk from the habitat to the ship, a giant Mars storm comes, and it blows Matt Damon away from the rest of his crew. I think they were even like tethered together. It ripped. He flew away. They just assumed he was dead because he was not responding to any of the calls, and so they leave him on Mars thinking he's dead. Spoiler alert, he's not dead. His name's Mark Watney, and he is not dead, and now he has to survive on Mars by himself. And the cool thing about this movie and this book is that Mark Watney is a botanist, so he knows how to plant and how to sow and reap and use botany as a way to sustain himself. And that's what he does. He figures out a way to make potatoes inside of the habitat. Now, sad thing is he has to live on potatoes for months and months and months and months and months and months and months. But he's figuring all this stuff out just using math and using his intelligence, using his ingenuity and all the things that God has given him. But eventually he reaches this place where he realizes something. I can't get home by myself. There's no way to get home. Yeah, I can keep planting, potatoes, and I can keep, living here. But in order to survive long term, I've got to get home. No amount of intelligence is going to get him off Mars. No amount of hard work is going to get him off Mars. No amount of determination, which he has all of those things. None of that is going to get him off Mars. It's not going to solve his biggest problem. If he's going to be saved, he's going to have to reach out to someone who can save him. And of course, that's what he does. He figures out a way to contact Earth again and to let them know, hey, I'm not dead. And so he reaches out, realizing that he doesn't have the answers himself. And I want to relate that to prayer for a moment. Have you ever noticed that prayer is often the first thing we talk about, and unfortunately, often the last thing that we actually do? When something goes wrong, our first instinct is to try to fix it ourselves. We study harder, we practice harder, we ask friends for advice, we make a plan, we look for a solution. Now, none of those things are necessarily wrong or bad. We should do all of those things. But eventually, every person is going to run into a problem that they cannot fix. They're going to come to a moment when there's nothing else left that they can do. A diagnosis comes back, a relationship falls apart. The problem is bigger than you. And suddenly you realize you are not in control. You can't fix this thing that you're in the midst of. And in those moments, prayers stop becoming just religious activities that you do, and it becomes your lifeline. It becomes the very breath you breathe. And tonight we're coming to this place in the book of Acts where the early church is facing a crisis like this. Who are the three closest disciples to Jesus? What were their names? Peter, John, and his brother James. Peter, James, and John. James becomes the pastor of the Jerusalem church. Okay? And not coincidentally, he is the first person that Herod goes after to try to kill. All right. So Herod kills James. He actually beheads James. And now in our text, Peter's going to get arrested. So he's going after the leaders of the church. I'm going to go after the pastor that's in Jerusalem. I'm going to go after Peter, who was one of Jesus' right-hand man. And what we're going to read about in a minute is that Peter is sitting in prison, chained between soldiers, guarded day and night, and is scheduled for execution. So humanly speaking, there's no hope. No one is going to get Peter out of prison. There's no lawyer that's coming. There's no army that's coming. There's no rescue mission that's coming. There's nothing any human being can do to get Peter out of this situation. The only thing the early church can do is pray. Now, before we continue, I want to point out something that I think is very important. And we've talked about this for a year and a half. James was beheaded and killed. Peter's going to be rescued. Okay? The same people prayed the same prayers in both situations. James gets arrested. The church prays. James gets killed. Peter gets arrested. The church prays. Peter gets rescued. The same sovereign God who is in control of everything allowed one to be killed and delivered the other one. So what that means is that Acts 12 is not a story about us twisting God's arm to get what we want. That is not what prayer is. We've talked about this over and over and over again. Prayer is not you twisting God's arm, praying hard enough, getting enough people to pray that God finally says, okay, fine, you got me. I'll let you have what you want. Because the same people prayed the same prayers, and in one instance, James gets killed. In the other instance, Peter is delivered. What we discover in this text is that when there is nothing else to do, it's not that prayer is just our last resort. Prayer is our greatest privilege. So let's read the first 11 verses of Acts chapter 12, and let's get into it tonight as the church becomes desperate and turns to a powerful, powerful God. About that time, Herod, the king, laid violent hands on some who belonged to the church. He killed James, the brother of John, with the sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter too. This was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending, after the Passover, to bring him out to the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnestly prayer for him was made to God by the church. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out, on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the doors were guarding the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone in the cell, and he struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and he followed him. He did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, for he thought it was a vision. When they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went out and went along one street. And immediately the angel left him. And when Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." First thing I want you to see tonight, first thing I want us to talk about is that the problem was bigger than them. The issue they were dealing with was bigger than them. One of the lessons that we've learned throughout Scripture, as we've been talking about prayer, is that God often teaches his people to pray by bringing them to the end of themselves. Sometimes what God does in our lives is he knows that we need to take another step in our growth. He knows he needs to mature us more. He knows that he needs to show us more of who he is and who we are in light of that. And so he brings us to the end of ourselves so that we are desperately praying to him. And that's exactly what's happening in this chapter. Luke begins by describing the situation that is happening, how the situation is growing darker and darker by each and every verse. He says at first that he laid hands on some of the leaders of the early church, and he ends up killing James by the sword, and now he's going to arrest Peter. The first apostle to be killed or to be martyred for his faith was James. Now, James was not some new believer. He wasn't a fringe member of the church. This is James, the brother of John, one of the 12, one of the men who had walked with Jesus closely for 3 years. He was one of the ones who was on the Mount of Transfiguration when they got a view of Jesus and what he was going to look like in his glorified state. He's one of Jesus' closest companions, and God allowed him to be killed. That reality should stop us for a minute, because Acts chapter 12 is not starting with the miracle. Okay? It's actually starting with a funeral. This man who loved Jesus with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength, who walked with Jesus for 3 years, was killed. So the reality of the persecution and suffering that the early church is experiencing needs to weigh on us before we move forward in the text. Because a lot of people think that I pray to God and that guarantees me some kind of outcome. I've told you guys about the movie The Shadowlands with it's about C.S. Lewis and finding his wife and his wife dying of cancer, and I've told you about that. And Anthony Hopkins plays C.S. Lewis. I think it was a late 80s movie, maybe early 90s. But Anthony Hopkins ends up C.S. Lewis ends up adopting Douglas Gresham. And Douglas Gresham was probably 12 or 13 years old, about the same age that C.S. Lewis was when C.S. Lewis lost his mother. And now Douglas has lost his mother to cancer. And there's this scene in the movie where they're up in the attic, and Douglas Gresham is just sitting on the stairs of the attic, just kind of overlooking the attic, and he's just weeping and crying. And C.S. Lewis comes in, he sits down next to him, and he says, "Jack," that's what everybody close to C.S. Lewis called him. He said, Jack, I prayed harder than I've ever prayed before, and it doesn't work." And C.S. Lewis says, "No, it doesn't work." Now, in that moment, he's not saying prayer isn't important. He's not saying that prayer isn't good. He's saying if your attitude about prayer is, I pray, and if I pray really hard, God answers that prayer, no, it doesn't work that way. Here, James dies. And the church doesn't understand why one apostle is rescued while the other apostle is martyred. And we don't understand that. Why did God let James die and yet he's going to rescue Peter? But for Luke, he's wanting to focus on the fact that the church is still praying. So they prayed for James. God said, "No, I'm not going to rescue James." The church doesn't throw up their hands and say, "Well, then forget it." Forget it. No, they continually, earnestly prayed, even when they didn't understand God's purpose. And what Herod does is in verse 3, well, let me ask you this question. What was Herod's motivation for arresting Peter? Look at the text. Look at the first 3 verses. He arrests James, he kills James, and in verse 3, what does it say is the motivation for Peter being arrested. What does it say? He saw how the Jewish leaders were pleased with the death and the killing of James. And Herod thought, ooh, what did Herod want to be, by the way? What was Herod's title? King of what? He wasn't the emperor of Rome. What was he? He was the king of the Jews. He was actually the king of the Jews. So when he saw that the Jewish people loved the fact that he killed James, he thought, what better way than to boost my popularity and look good in the eyes of these people? Let's just keep taking out the leaders of this new movement. And so he arrests Peter. Peter becomes the next target. He wants the applause of the crowd. So the situation gets worse. He seizes Peter in verse 4. He puts him into prison. He delivers him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him. This is not normal security. They estimate probably 16 soldiers are guarding this one man. Herod is going to make sure that Peter does not leave this prison alive. Every detail that Luke includes for us is letting us know the situation seems humanly impossible to overcome. It's why Luke's including all the details. 4 squadrons chained up in a cell, people outside the cell. He's chained also to 2 soldiers. And then there's a gate outside. He's giving us all these details because Luke wants us to see how impossible this was. But what do the people keep doing in verse 5? Earnestly praying. I love, we've talked about the big buts of the Bible before. Okay? Look at what it says in verse 5. So Peter was kept in prison, but earnest prayer for him was made to God by the people. That little word, but, changes the entire story. The church can't overthrow Herod. Peter can't break himself out of prison. He's not going to pick a lock, but they can pray. John Piper once said, you have this quote in front of you. John Piper once said, prayer is the language of dependence. When we pray, we are declaring our dependence upon God. And what kind of prayer, look at the text in verse 5, what kind of prayers are they doing? Earnest prayers. These weren't casual prayers. These weren't quick prayers before a meal. The church understood the seriousness of this situation, the seriousness of this moment, and their prayers are reflecting it. And notice who is praying. Earnest prayers are being made by who? The whole church. Not just the powerful ones, not just the ones that know Peter really well. All of them are praying. The entire body of believers gathering together in prayer. And Luke emphasizes this fact. Matthew Henry, who wrote a giant volume of commentaries in the 1700s, said this. Look at the quote as well. Nothing tends more to unite the people of God than united prayer. We've talked about that before. What unites people together? Well, it's when they pray together. So, churches ending their resources, they don't have anything else to give. All they can do is pray and depend upon God. Second thing I want us to talk about is that the waiting was longer than they wanted. The waiting was longer than they wanted. One of the hardest things about prayer is not the praying itself, it's the waiting. Most of us would not mind praying if God would answer our prayer the first time we pray it. Right? If you knew every time I pray, God's going to give me an answer right then and right there. So if we pray for something, God's going to say, nope, not yet, not right now. Or yes, I'm going to do what you're praying for. If we knew it, I think most of us would have no problem praying. The struggle about prayer is that we often have to wait to find out what God is going to do. And that's exactly what the church finds out in Acts chapter 12. They prayed, they continued to pray, but Peter is still in prison. Nothing seems to change from verses 5 to verse 6. Peter's in prison. Festivals are going on. Peter's in prison. Then we read in verse 6 that finally Herod is going to bring Peter out, basically to be judged publicly in front of the people and executed. Now, I want you to think about this. They have been praying, and they have been praying, and they have been praying. And now we are to the very last moment, the very last chance for God to do something. And then he does it. I just want you to think about that, because I read this and I was like, why wouldn't God just free him right off the bat? Like, why wouldn't God just free him right after he goes in to prison? Why does God wait until the very last moment, put the church through all of that desperation, and then the very last moment say, all right, now I'm going to do something? The rescue was not immediate. From the church's perspective, every day the situation was getting worse and worse and worse. Every hour that passes was bringing Peter closer to death. And the truth is, this is the way God often works. He works in a way that we don't expect. We want immediate answers, and God teaches us to wait. We want deliverances, and God teaches us to persevere. Maybe God was teaching the church, what will you do if you don't get what you want right away? Will you keep praying? Will you keep being earnest? Will you keep going? Early in our series, last year in 2025, I read you this quote. I want to read it again. It's by William Gurnall, and it says this: God's delays are not God's denials. God's delays are not God's denials. There's this fascinating thing. What is Peter doing the night before he's about to get killed? What's he doing? Say it out loud. What's he doing? He's sleeping. Now, I don't know about you, but if tomorrow is my execution day, I don't know if I'd be able to sleep.
I'm like mentally observing the difference between the night before, like Jesus in the garden, and like, now obviously, like, we don't know, like, if he like later was just like, all right, I'm gonna go to sleep now, I said my piece with the Father, I know how it's all gonna work out, whatever. Well, okay, I don't know, I guess I'm answering my own question.
Well,
I'm like sitting here thinking like the same thing. I'm like, I would have been sweating blood.
yeah, I mean, Jesus sweated drops of blood.
Right, but like the way that it's recorded is like Jesus is over here like praying, sweating, blood, freaking out,
And Peter's
like,
sleeping.
Peter's like, nah, I'm not sleeping.
Here's what I think. I thought about that too. Here's what I think. This is just what I think. It's just what I think.
I already disagree.
Not surprised.
Is this in the Bible that you're about to say?
No, this is just what I think. Yeah, it's just what I think. When you see your Savior die, and you see him resurrected from the dead, there is a sense in which that core belief of like, he can take my head off, I know this is not the end.
Oh, that's good.
Like I know this isn't the end. And that is the reason why Christianity is true, guys. One of the greatest evidences of Christianity being true is that all of these people died believing Jesus rose from the dead.
Again, we said this earlier in a different study. You will die. You will not die for a lie. You will only die for what you believe to be true. Now, that's not proof itself that it's true, but what it guarantees is that Peter, there is no doubt in Peter's mind, Jesus Christ rose from the dead, and this dude Herod can take my head off, he doesn't win. Because I've already seen it with my own eyes. And so there is a sense in which his confidence is in Christ. It's not in the circumstance he's in. And plus, he's seen Jesus. I mean, yeah, Jesus was sweating drops of blood, and he was anxious, and he was praying. But do you remember after he prays, there's that resolve that switches?
Right.
You remember that? When Jesus goes to the disciples, and he was like, hey, I told you guys to pray. You didn't pray. The time for praying is over. Get up. And it's like there's this resolve that Jesus is like, all right, I turned it all over. Now, Peter probably for days has been praying like this. But now he's like, this is the last night. God has obviously said, this is what's for you. So he's like, all right, I'm going to take it. And I love the fact that the angel wakes him up by this is my visual of it. The angel shows up in the room. He's shining. This light is in the cell. Peter's still asleep. And it's like the angel has to go over there and like kick him in the side and just be like, Peter, wake up, dude. What are you doing? And Peter looks up at him, and Peter is so rattled by what's happening that the angel has to tell him what to do. The chains fall off of him, and the angel looks at him and says, Peter, put your shoes on. Put your cloak on, Peter. Like he's just kind of shell-shocked. Like, what's happening? And he's like, stand up, put your shoes on, put your robe on. I'm going to get you out of here. And Peter's he's in this daze. He doesn't see what God is doing, but God's already at work. And doesn't that happen all the time? In the waiting, God's working and we don't even know he's working. And then God answers the prayer and we're like, oh, God was doing something all along and I didn't even know he was doing it. It's one of the great lessons of prayer. Just because you can't see God working doesn't mean God isn't working. The church has been praying and praying and praying. They haven't seen God working, but God obviously has been working. Deliverance was on the way. By the way, as God is delivering Peter, guess what the church is doing? Praying. God probably Peter is probably already out of the prison and walking around in the street, and the church is still praying that God will get him out of prison. God had already answered their prayer, and they were still praying that he would answer their prayer. And God had already done it. They just didn't even know it. I love this quote by Spurgeon. It's one of the most popular quotes that Spurgeon ever gave. When you cannot trace God's hand, in other words, when you don't know what God is doing, you must trust his heart. When you can't trace his hand, you must trust his heart. God is no less faithful in the waiting than he is when he gives us the answer we're looking for. And then the last verses, how God does this thing. The Lord was greater than they imagined. Chains fall off. Peter gets, the angel said, get up quickly. Like, what are you doing? Get up. I'm here to let you out. Dress yourself. Put on your sandals. Then, remember earlier when I told you that Luke is laying out all of the difficulties? He's in chains, the soldiers, the gates. Remember I told you, and that he's doing that to show us how from a human perspective, there's nothing they could do. Well, now he's going to list all those same things, and it's God doing. So the chains fall off. Well, he listed the chains for us. They passed the first guard that he was chained to. Verse 10, they passed the second guard. They come to the iron gate. It opens for them of its own accord. You know what that means, right? Chains fall off. They walk past the soldiers. They walk past the next group of soldiers. They walk past one gate. They go to the iron gate. And when they get to the iron gate that opens up into the city, the gates open up by themselves. As they get to it, the gates just open up. It's God saying, listen, I can do what none of the humans can do. Chains fall off. Soldiers, you just walk right by them. Gates open up. Luke, who stacked up all these obstacles in front of Peter, is now showing how God is removing all of those very same obstacles. So he sets them all up at the beginning of the story, and now God removes all of those obstacles at the end of the story. And the point is to show how powerful God is. The church was praying not because they knew exactly what God would do. God just let James die. They were praying because they knew who God was. They knew what God had done in their lives. And there's a difference in that kind of prayer. Faith is not confidence that God is going to give you the outcome that you desire. Faith is the confidence to say, God, whatever you desire, I'm going to trust you. So I got a friend of mine, and earlier in his life, he kind of bought into the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel. You've heard me talk about that, right? What is the health, wealth, and prosperity gospel? What is the name it and claim it gospel? What is that? What do I mean when I say that? Elliot, what do I mean when I say that? Health, wealth, prosperity gospel, name it and claim it. What do I mean when I say that? What's the belief system around that kind of Christianity? Yeah.
Wealth for everyone, or
Not just wealth for everyone, health for everyone, well-being for everyone, physical success for everyone. And if you don't get it,
then it's not really happen. It's kind of like you have this ideal, like you said, when some Christians think of like the ideal version,
okay,
they can see it physically and they can understand it like perfectly fine.
but what if you don't get health, wealth, and prosperity? That doctrine, why don't you get it? You don't have enough faith. And if you had more faith, you would get what you were asking for. That is the name it and claim it. I name what I want, I claim what I want, and by faith, I'm going to get it. So a buddy of mine was kind of buying into that early in our relationship. We been friends in college, and we're still friends to this day. And I'll never forget, we're driving down the road. I had picked him up, and I'm driving down the road right by the Whataburger in Saxe. Like, I know exactly where I was. We pass what is now a CVS, and he was telling me, Neil, you just don't have enough faith to get what you asked for. And I looked at him, and this was my response. I think it takes more faith to believe like me than it does to believe like you. Because your faith is just, I'm going to have this faith and God's going to say yes no matter what. My faith says what really Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said. Remember what they said to the king when he was about to throw him into the fiery furnace? They said, listen, our God is able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't, we will not kneel to you. My faith to say, I'm going to pray earnestly, but I am going to submit to God's will, and whatever he says, whatever he sovereignly wills, I'm going to continue to trust him no matter what. It takes more faith to believe that than it does to just name it and claim it. Real faith is confidence that God is able to do whatever he wills and that you are going to submit to that. James had died, Peter was delivered. And the same group of people were praying the same prayers. God was sovereign over both. A.W. Tozer wrote a great book called The Knowledge of the Holy. Here's what he says. True prayer, you got this in front of you. True prayer is not an attempt to get God to do our will, but a desire that he will accomplish his will through us. That's what prayer is. Finally, Peter recognizes what's happening, and he's like, oh, yeah, I have been delivered out of Herod's hand and out of what the Jews expected. This wasn't luck. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't human ability. This was all the hand of God. And this is the lesson the church needed to learn right here at the very beginning of its establishment. The problem was bigger than they were. The waiting was longer than they wanted, but their God was more powerful than they ever imagined. You ever prayed and just thought, man, this prayer that I just prayed, that was pretty weak? Or have you ever prayed and felt weak while you were praying it? Like, God, I'm praying this thing, but this thing is, I don't feel strong. I don't feel like I got a lot of faith right now. I feel weak. I feel broken. I feel I can't even muster up the kind of prayer that I think would even come before your throne. John Calvin said this, our prayers are weak. Our prayers are weak, but the God who hears them is strong. You ever heard something, man, that was a powerful prayer? Scrap that nonsense. It's the God we're praying to that's powerful. That prayer is coming from a human being. Prayer doesn't work because the prayer is powerful. Prayer works because God is powerful. And when God's people pray, God uses those prayers to accomplish his will. So I need you to understand something. There is going to come times in your life, if it hasn't already happened, it's going to happen, where you are going to have giant obstacles in your way. You're going to have huge enemies, impossible situations. But when you trust in God, you are trusting in a God. You are putting your confidence in a God who is more powerful than all of them. If gates that are shut and locked, if God just says open, they open. Chains that are around your wrist, if God says fall off, they fall off. But God is going to put us in situations where the only avenue that you have is prayer. He does that on purpose. He takes away all of your ability to fix anything. You can't do anything to fix this or make it better. And God does that on purpose, so all you will do is desperately pray. Because we discover something in those moments. When there is nothing else left but prayer, don't consider it a last resort. Consider it your greatest privilege. When you find yourself in a situation you can't control, don't despair. Do what the early church did. Pray. Take it to the Lord and trust him with the outcome. Because your greatest problems are never bigger than your God. Ever. Ever. No matter how big they are. Again, if somebody kills you for your faith, that death doesn't win. The worst thing that can happen, we think of that. The worst thing that can happen to me is that I get sick and die. I get cancer and I die. What happens to me happens, or what happens to a loved one of mine is what happened to C.S. Lewis's wife, or C.S. Lewis's mom, or like we hear all these stories, but the reality is, and it's probably why Peter could sleep, Jesus defeated death. all of your biggest enemies have been conquered. And no matter what happens, your God is bigger. And you can take us out. You can kill us. We can go out in a myriad of ways. But death is not the end, because our God is bigger. So we trust in our bigger God no matter what his will is.